had been foreign minister back in 1938, had resigned because of Britain's appeasement of dictators. As prime minister, he was faced by this man, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser, ruler of Egypt, wanted to unite the whole Arab world, a world in which Britain played a major role. Hoping to remain neutral in the Cold War, Nasser refused to join an anti-Soviet pact set up by the British. Above all, he wanted the Arab states to throw off foreign influence. This, of course, included Britain, which had, until very recently, controlled Egypt's government. Nasser attacked the British as colonialist bloodsuckers and encouraged Britain's Arab allies to break away from Britain. Nasser also wanted to improve the lives of his people. He planned to build a great new dam across the Nile at Aswan. This would provide hydroelectric power for industry and irrigate much more land. He hoped to get the money for this from the US and Britain, and at first it seemed likely he would. But he'd continued to stir up trouble for Britain. And then Ghlub Pasha, the British commander of Jordan's army, was sacked. Eden was convinced that Nasser was responsible for this. A secret report said that Nasser had become utterly pro-Soviet. Eden was worried about increasing Soviet involvement in the Middle East. So were the Americans, who cancelled their loan for the Aswan Dam. Eden was quick to follow. On July the 26th, 1956, Nasser took over the Suez Canal Company by force and nationalized it. He claimed he'd used the shipping tolls to help finance the dam. But Britain had helped run the canal with France and owned nearly half the company's shares ever since the 19th century. The British felt humiliated and alarmed. Most of the oil they needed for their factories and transport passed through the canal en route to Britain. If the tankers had to go 3,000 miles round Africa, fuel supplies would be very expensive. The economy could be damaged. Almost from the word go, Eden may have considered using force to overthrow Nasser and get him replaced by someone more friendly to British interests. The British had troops in Cyprus and Malta, but they weren't prepared for a quick operation. Besides that, Nasser had been buying arms from the Soviets and might put up stiff resistance. So Eden almost certainly hoped for help against Nasser from the Americans, Britain's oldest allies. Both the US President Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, were fiercely anti-communist. But they themselves had little at stake in Egypt and felt Eden overestimated Nasser's power. Besides, Eisenhower was standing for re-election as a man of peace. He couldn't afford to get involved. But there were others who had reason to dislike Nasser and act on it. The French had a rebellion on their hands in Algeria, one of their Arab colonies. Nasser had been aiding the rebels with arms, and the French wanted this stopped. As main shareholders in the Suez Canal Company, they had the most to lose financially if the shipping tolls went to Egypt. They too depended on easy passage through the canal for their essential oil supplies. And the French were firm allies of Israel, the Jewish state in a sea of hostile Arab nations. Nasser had bitterly resented the foundation of Israel. Egypt had already prevented Israel from using the canal. And in 1955, Nasser had closed off the Gulf of Aqaba, the Israelis' only shipping outlet to the Red Sea. What's more, he allowed Palestinian guerrillas to use Egypt as a base for attacks on Israel. When he bought Soviet arms, the Israelis thought they were for use against them. So were the motives of the Israelis, the French, and the British strong enough for them to have planned to act together against Egypt? Eden was asked at the time. He replied, there was no advanced knowledge that Israel would attack. Is there any evidence to suggest he mightn't have told the truth? In 1964, a Canadian journalist published this book based on sources he was not allowed publicly to reveal. In 1966, the BBC based a documentary on it. This claimed that on October the 22nd, a plane brought Ben Gurion, the Prime Minister of Israel, and other Israelis to Paris. They met Guy Mollet, the French Prime Minister, and his colleagues. They were said to have driven to an unidentified house in Sèvres. There they discussed a combined attack on Egypt. But since Britain couldn't risk losing her Arab friends, the idea was that Israel would attack through the Sinai Desert first. Then Britain and France would come in and take back the canal in the name of keeping Egypt and Israel apart. Britain's key negotiator was Selwyn Lloyd, who was then the Foreign Secretary. He was accompanied by Patrick Dean from the Foreign Office.
Selwyn Lloyd, from what I gather, stayed there for about an hour and a half. He flew back with a tentative agreement on about 10 major points. Patrick Dean stayed at the villa, and that night at about 10 o'clock, Selwyn Lloyd had dinner with Anthony Eden, and the tentative agreement was approved, and the following day it was drafted as a secret treaty, and it was signed by Ben Gurion for Israel, Mollet for France, and Patrick Dean for Britain.
Could Robertson be believed? After all, he wasn't an eyewitness, and many people denied his story. But 10 years later, it had been confirmed by several sources. Anthony Nutting, the minister who'd resigned over the affair, gave the BBC more details.
And then suddenly, the French came up with this plan, whereby the Israelis would take the initiative. They would invade Egyptian territory. They would march to the Suez Canal, and Britain and France would then intervene. So we would then, in effect, retake possession of the Suez Canal and the Suez Canal Company. And this, in its turn, would be such a humiliation for President Nasser that he would be toppled from his perch.
Then, 10 years later, in 1986, Donald Logan, Selwyn Lloyd's private secretary at the time of Suez, told how he'd been sent to Sèvres when the final plan was discussed.
And Pat Dean asked me whether it was in order to sign it. I said, well, this is an accurate record of what we've been talking about, and it seems a good basis of diplomacy to be able to take back a bit of paper that everybody agrees to. So I see no harm in putting our mark to it.
But Eden was furious that France and Israel had copies of the document and sent Dean and Logan back to try to get them destroyed. They failed.
Next morning, Eden instructed us in the private office and the Foreign Office to send over to number 10 all the copies that had been made of this document and of the translation of it from French into English. And they were sent to number 10. And that was the last that either Pat Dean or I saw of that document when it was left in Eden's hands.
But the Israelis had kept their copy in Ben Gurion's archives. In 1986, their custodian described it.
The document even included the wording of the ultimata that Britain and France would place before Egypt and Israel. This agreed scenario bore the signatures of the representatives of 3 countries, but the most important items were, I suspect, that it began with a preamble that said that it was the government of the United Kingdom, the royal government of the United Kingdom, the State of Israel, and the Republic of France, all together joined together. And at the end on the left is the signature of Pinot, on the right of David Ben Gurion, and on the bottom of Patrick Dean.
In 1987, official cabinet papers were made available to the British public.
The splits in Sir Anthony Eden's government over the Suez Crisis in 1956 are revealed in cabinet papers released today under the 30-year secrecy rule, and they confirm that Sir Anthony Eden lied to the House of Commons when he denied that a secret deal had been struck with Israel to provide a pretext for the Suez invasion.
So, having set up the attack on Egypt, why did the British and French give up before Nasser had been toppled? The Soviets had certainly threatened to use force against them if they didn't withdraw, but it was the Americans who decided the issue. The war had weakened the value of the pound. Eden was under enormous pressure, and Eisenhower refused to buy sterling and so support the pound unless the fighting stopped. Britain gave in. But why did the French? Apparently, Eden phoned Mollet, the French Prime Minister, and said,
"Well, this pressure is getting worse day by day, and I have just received a telephone call from Eisenhower asking me to call a ceasefire in 12 hours. So Mollet said, 12 hours is quite quick. Couldn't it wait 2 or 3 days? In that time, we could get a good position along the canal that would put us in a good negotiating position." "No," said Eden, "it's not possible. I can't hold on." "Try," said Mollet. And at that moment, Eden said, "Well, I must confess I've already accepted."
So the French had to go along with Eden. Who gained most from all this? Israel had got the Gulf of Aqaba opened for her shipping. She'd destroyed the Palestinian guerrilla bases in Sinai. But she had to return Sinai to Egypt when the UN force was sent in to keep the peace. France felt betrayed by Britain, and the Algerian rebels hadn't been stopped. So what about Britain? The British failed to keep the canal open. In fact, it was blocked for months. Arab sympathizers blew up overland oil supplies to the Mediterranean. So Britain had to ration petrol after all. British and Commonwealth opinion had been dangerously divided. Far from being toppled, Nasser became a hero to the many Arabs who wanted to be rid of Western influence. All British citizens working in Egypt were expelled. And when the troops left Egypt, British prestige in the Middle East declined substantially. But thanks to their threats, Soviet influence increased. Above all, it was clear that Britain could no longer intervene in this way without American backing. The United States had taken over as the foremost Western power.
Within the next 24 hours, Soviet ships crossing the Atlantic on their way to Cuba are expected to encounter ships of the U.S. Navy. The U.S. naval vessels have orders from President Kennedy to stop and search all ships going to Cuba and to sink those who refuse to obey orders. According to intelligence reports, Soviet captains have orders not to allow their cargoes to be searched. Unless Moscow countermands these orders, an occasion for war may arise. Cuban leader Fidel Castro described President Kennedy as savage, barbaric, and shameless. All armed forces have been ordered to battle stations.
How did a small Caribbean island push the two superpowers to the verge of nuclear war? Cuba is only 90 miles from the United States mainland,